Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. Brunello, today we're talking about why reindustrializing America is easier said than done. It seems to be sort of a major part of the policy proposals of every American administration, but particularly for this one, perhaps. Brunello, we discussed something about new imperialism in our recent analysis and the sort of reinvigoration of the spheres of influence approach. Can you tell me a bit more about how that serves as a background for this discussion?
Yeah, it's very helpful because one needs to understand the premises for introducing tariffs across the board. So, effectively, if we assume that the world would be divided in spheres of influence, with China effectively extending projecting its power over Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and then potentially Latin America and Eastern Europe via Russia, one understands that effectively what's left for the US is effectively North America, the immediate northern part of Latin America, let's say including Venezuela, um, and Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So it's effectively the G7, if you want, plus other additions. The Middle East is a bit of a contended area between US and China, and Latin America, again, is a bit contended because the US will not easily um, um, dismiss their influence in what they consider to be their kind of backyard. But that's absolutely crucial because if you look that on a map, it's clear that China extends its influence effectively all over the world, a little bit less so in this area that I just mentioned for the US. And so it makes perfect sense for the US in a retrenchment type of mode to seal this kind of new borders. Instead, they are now a bit porous. Um, to the north, Canada and Greenland are not as protected or protectable as they would be under the US, especially their Arctic exposure, which is directly in confrontation with Russia on the other side. And to the south, regaining control of the Panama Canal means effectively controlling whatever comes north of that. So if you start looking the world divided in these kind of spheres of influence, you start understanding why tariffs have been imposed.
And, you know, going back, you sort of paint also this historical background of the 1970s, the high inflation of the 1970s and 80s, that there were a number of reasons for, but was ultimately beat down. What were some of those reasons? How similar do you think is this current moment, and is any of that advice still useful?
Yeah, so the the story is that effectively, once you divide the world in spheres of influence, you then have to compete with their geopolitical rival. And you compete if we look at the, let's say, production function as a proxy for what you need to do in order to prevail in the longer run. Production function is typically a function of labor, capital, and total factor productivity. This is what the economists call it. And so um, labor can be measured by population. The larger the population, the more advantage you got. Capital can be thought as in terms of industrial production, uh, how much physical goods you can actually produce to sustain your long-term battle against the geopolitical rival. And total factor productivity can be thought as technological advancement. Now, on population, the US is really behind and will never catch up because on the other side, you got 1.4 billion people for China alone. And if you start looking the entire spheres of influence, it's is way beyond what the US and its allies can ever reach. In terms of uh, um, in terms of uh, technological development, this is of course an area that is open for contention because um, uh, as you know, both sides are making advancement in this area, but the US believes to be ahead. So the real area of in which we don't know who's going to prevail is effectively capital or production. And let's not forget that in World War II, this is what really won the war. The US came in with their massively bigger uh, capacity of producing industrial goods that effectively meant at some point needed planes, tanks, and everything, warships, anything that could be helped to win war. So the more you can have in your sphere of influence, the better. Now, China is the factory of the world, so it's clearly ahead. The US wants to repatriate all this stuff from the countries where it was offshored over the last decades in order to compete with that.
Yeah. And finally, looking forward, what is Trump suggesting in order to just sort of, reverse this process to reshore, intervene, and industrialize the United States? And how likely is this to actually, happen, given the current state of the American economy?
So you have to think in this following terms. Um, when the US um, decided to abandon the gold standard with the new version of the gold standard, which was the Bretton Woods Agreement signed in 1944, and this decision came in 1971. This marked a completely sea change in history because effectively Donald Trump decided to Nixon at the time decided to de-anchor the value of the dollar from that of the of gold. And then at the same time, he also made another important step. He went to China, the famous Nixon in China, we discussed this before, and began the period of globalization. Now, with these two things, effectively, uh, inflation was unleashed on the one end, because the dollar lost its anchor to gold. But on the other hand, a very, very prolonged period of disinflation started because of deglobalization and the offshoring. And that was absolutely crucial to keep a lead on inflation. So central bank independence that was started to be granted those days, and Paul Volcker brought the US into a recession to bring inflation down because he could increase rates for as much as he wanted. Yes. Um, Central bank independence and globalization managed to keep a lead on long-term on inflation and therefore on long-term bond yields. Now, why does long-term bond yield matter? Because in a system of fiat currency in which the dollar is not anchored to the gold anymore, what really matters is the ability of uh, the US taxpayer to repay their own debt. Okay? So the point that we try to make in this entire discussion is the following. Reversing all this mechanism is massively complicated. So think about the US, they anchor the dollar from gold. Inflation start going up also because of the two oil shocks. How did they keep a lid on that? They granted central bank independence and they allow globalization to kick in. And inflation start coming down, long-term yields start coming down, the price of bonds for the yields stabilized, and that was the guarantee that the value of the dollar was somehow anchored. Now put this in reverse. You stop globalization, you reduce central banking dependence, because this is what Trump is doing with his continuous attacks to Powell. Yes. Um, uh, and then inflation ensues. If inflation ensues, then the real value of bonds goes down, long-term yields tends to increase, and therefore you lost the nominal anchor to the dollar. Hence, this massive reaction that you have on April the 2nd when financial markets went berserk and investors start selling US denominated assets across the board, equities, bonds, currency, and credit, like an EM crisis. So the idea that you can easily reverse what has been engineered over the last 50 years, and especially at this peak, without paying no prices, makes no sense. Effectively, you have to choose. Do you want a world in which you have, yes, a current account deficit, but also uh, with attached security responsibility, of course, but then you have low inflation, low long-term yields, and a relatively stable value of your debt and therefore of your currency. That's choice number one, what we had so far. Or you deglobalize, you de-dollarize the economy, you put tariffs on things, which means inflation goes up, long-term yield goes up, um, and the value of your currency cannot be granted anymore, and people start looking for alternatives around the world, and therefore you further induce this division of the world in spheres of influence because people are looking for not anymore the global hegemon but local hegemon. So at least the more proxy hegemon that they got, that for many countries is going to be China. So this is the set of choices that needs to be made. Um, and they are not easy at all. They cannot be solved with the political slogan such as let's put tariffs, we're going to be happy. It doesn't work like this. There are huge consequences for these decisions. They need to be made consensually with your allies, with the full consent of the people of your country that needs to understand the consequences of what they are buying into, and then suffer the consequences if they are those. Because if you don't want a globalized economy, you want a fragmented economy because you think this is better for whatever reason, you don't want to keep your empire anymore, it's fine, but you need to be absolutely clear about what the consequences could be. These things cannot be done in 50 years and undone in 3 weeks.
Yeah. It seems like the fact that there's a sell-off in all sorts of US assets across all asset classes, goes deeper than one particular phenomenon. It points to a sort of larger destruction of America's role in the world and the rule of law in, investor confidence in the American economy, which will have much sort of broader implications, and in turn, affect the market reaction, the electoral reaction, particularly in the midterms coming up, in sort of just under 2 years' time. So, as always, Bernardo, much to watch for later. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Bye, until next time.